Welcome everyone to the third webinar in our Neurodevelopmental Movement Lecture Series with Bette Lamont. Bette's been a practitioner for 33 years, an educator and writer working nationally and internationally with families and professionals. She's full of so much knowledge, love, and care. Today we'll be discussing the neurobiology of learning issues. This is the third in our lecture series.
Want to let you know that if you weren't here for the past 2 weeks, you will still get a lot of great information, and this is just the right place for you to be today. And if you have been, we're going to go back to the same process that we went to in reviewing the developmental chart. And Jesse, if you want to put that up, that developmental chart is core. It's a discipline almost, because that chart, and you've seen it before if you've been here for the last couple of weeks, gives us a way to anchor in our relevant information we collect from clients. So if you come to me and you say, I have a child that runs funny and can't do math to save himself and has no friends, what would you do? I would say, I don't know. I don't know because I don't know where his symptoms show up on this chart of normal neurological development. Once we get all of the information that you see in front of you in this chart about that child, then we can decide what aspects of the learning and behavior problems are developmental and which may be due to other factors in the child's life. So last week, we went through this chart in regards to trauma. This week, we're going in through this chart in regards to learning behaviors and the activities and challenges that keep children from succeeding at school. When you look at this chart, for those of you who weren't here last time, one side of the chart tells us about how our child develops. So incoming information, how they create a brain that can process visual and auditory and tactile skills. And when you look at the other side of the chart, you're looking at the parts of the brain that do output, how we move around, how we communicate, and how we use our hands. This is where I began with this work. I began in 1987, and 90% of the children that we were seeing at that time were coming into the center where I trained in Oregon with reading problems and dyslexia and dysgraphia and ADD and clumsiness, poor social skills. And it was much more rare to find behavior disorders, brain injuries, and autism at that time was diagnosed in only 1 in I think about 4,000 children. Now we are seeing autism in 1 in 45 children, and a significant portion of the clients I work with are on the spectrum. But those are the people that I was working with in 1987, and I learned so much about how we learn. And certainly, learning is a cortical function, and you do need a good cortex to learn. Indeed, you do, right? You need to be able to think well. But tonight, what I want to do is to explore some of the lower levels that may prevent that cortex from working to its capacity. And it has been shocking to me how many of the children that I work with, once they have the precortical levels of the brain integrated, are able to learn much more easily and with very little cortical intervention. And we're not going to talk about cortical interventions tonight. We're going to talk about these lower levels of the brain. So what do I mean by the lower levels? Well, when you look at that chart in front of you, you see a green line that's right through the middle of it there. And that green line from there and on up, from about on average 12 months on up, we have a cortex available that can walk and talk and think and create and design and express our feelings. But below that, we have 3 layers of the brain that we want to look at to see how they might be interfering with that cortex. So we are going to look at how the brain takes in information and puts out information at these lower levels. Now, we could very quickly run through that first level. That medulla and spinal cord is so deep in the brain that if you're injured there, you are very likely to die if you have a profound injury to the medulla or spinal cord. And if you have an injury there and survive, you're likely to be very disabled. So we're going to talk about the 90% or so of kids that we work with who have issues at 2 different levels of the brain. And when you're looking at the chart, and if you followed me for these 3 weeks, you know this is the only part I've talked about. That doesn't mean we're not treating all the rest of it. We treat children and adults with injuries anywhere on that continuum, but our focus has been for the larger population, the most common kind of situations we see. So we're going to start talking about not the medulla and spinal cord. I'd like you to go up 1 layer to that orange layer called the pons. And we're going to take a look at what happens to eyes and how the development of vision that happens during this very early, in the first half of that first year, is just critical for learning. One of the features, if you're down at that orange level and you look under visual there, you'll see it. It does say horizontal tracking. And horizontal tracking is not present in many of the kids that I work with. This is a skill that's developed right in that crawling period of time, and it's encoded in the brain through crawling. It is developed and encoded through crawling. And what you see with children who don't have good horizontal eye tracking is they may be skipping words. They might skip the little words, or they might skip a last letter. They might fill in words or letters. Like if you look at the word horse and then you look at the word house, very similar looking. And if your eyes skip over that middle letter, you might substitute horse for house or vice versa. Kids will also switch letters around. Jumped on the house, where maybe the house jumped. You see all kinds of funny little variations. Some of the kids that have the horizontal tracking issues are the ones that track with their finger. So our language, our Western languages track the words across from left to right in the horizontal. And that's the first visual skill that we develop that's related to learning. And we need that very much. The other thing that develops at this time is comfortable eye contact. So you see the children with darting eyes, and you try to catch their eyes, and they look away and they dart, and they're not potentially not feeling safe in the learning environment. And I want to talk just for a minute. This little eye contact thing sort of opens a door for me to be able to talk about the role of oxytocin, because oxytocin is the love and cuddle hormone in the brain that can be triggered in part just by making eye contact with someone that you care about. But oxytocin overall is supportive of a part of the brain called the hippocampus. The hippocampus is responsible for aspects of learning and memory, and it is so critical for learning that when it's suppressed, we can't learn well. The hormone cortisol, if we're scared, if we can't make comfortable eye contact, if we're anxious, cortisol can shut down the work of the hippocampus and elevate the amygdala, the fight or flight response. So it could be that our child with the darting eyes is dealing with some issues that relate to anxiety, which we talked about last week, but which deeply affect learning. So regulating the pons helps mature the tracking and supports easy eye contact and oxytocin release. So when we're supporting that brain to mature, and we'll go back through this a couple of times, what we're doing is we're going to be going back and replicating the activities that would have happened during that time period for the infant. And the brain is very resilient, and over the lifespan, we can go back and we can replicate normal development to put these functions into place. But those are the visual skills that can interfere. Now, auditorily, and we're in that little orange box, it says vital response to threatening sounds. This is where the startle response comes up, and it can cause discomfort in the classroom. I work with many children who are terrified of school because they hate the fire drills. Now, how often does a fire drill happen? Maybe once every 6 months. I've had a couple of children who could not tolerate school because they're constantly afraid of fire drills or bells. So they can't engage in the learning because they're constantly dealing with the cortisol rush. And I know the setting is so different now. I don't know how we're going to go back to school and if it will feel the same. I don't know if our children will be dealing with fire drills and bells ringing between classes 2 years from now, but I know that these are the issues that challenge children that I have been working with up to this time. So the sensory issues in general impact our social skills. And at this level of the brain, we find our kids are sensory seeking. And if you look over one more box where it says perception of vital sensation, heat and cold and pain and hunger. Now I want to talk about the pain part, and that's mediated through this level of the brain. For our children that don't feel pain immediately and appropriately, they need a lot of strong sensory input just to be present in their bodies. So they may be the child that's kicking the desk, that is pinching the child next to them, that is causing chaos. Now, what does chaos have to do with pain? Well, they always need a lot of strong sensory input just to feel normal. For you and for me, probably just bumping around through your world gives you enough sensory input that you feel normal. But for kids with a higher threshold, they need a lot of constant input. So you might find these kids shoving in classmates. They may be the ones that run to the classroom door and bang into it. Even, they're the first one in line and they throw their whole body at the door. They can be the kids that scream because that creates a lot of chaos. I've even seen them overturning desks and hitting teachers and hitting other kids. So that creates a social environment that isn't very productive for learning for that child or for anyone else in the classroom. And I like to say, for those of you that have the more quiet children, if you see a child that's behaving that way, certainly you don't like your child in that classroom, but the judgment about them being a bully, you might want to revise that a little bit after listening to this, because this is probably a neurologically impaired child who needs to do this in order for themselves to feel normal. They're seeking normal, and your child who may be sensory avoidant is seeking normal, and they're all in the same classroom. So it sets us up for a poor learning environment. Now, if you go over one more box to the other side of the midline there at that pons level, that's that crawling baby, the baby that's on their tummy moving forward. And this crawling activity is going to support what we've just talked about. The baby that crawls has better horizontal eye tracking. The baby that crawls is we're going to be bringing down their responsiveness to threatening sounds or perceived threatening sounds. The baby that crawls, we can provide sensory programs that will support the crawling and help bring that pain threshold into a range of normal. One of the greatest things that I hear from parents is that week when they realize they haven't had a rage and they haven't had screaming and they haven't had desks turned over for the past month, and they suddenly realize that this is new behavior. It's not just a fluke. And that's always really exciting. But the crawling child is also developing range of motion in the proximal joints. So when I say proximal joints, I mean the shoulders and the hips. So when the child hasn't developed that, what you can see is the kid that has that kind of bulky, awkward run. They run funny. They might look like a snowman running across the playground. They're the kid that other kids are going to notice, and they're going to tease, and they may have a lot of playground issues. There are just many, many opportunities for teasing this child, because this is the child that if they can't track and they're not reading, and then they scream if an alarm goes off in school, and then they run funny, immediately you've got a setup for teasing. And these are neurological issues. These are not character or personality issues. So our runs funny, teasable child very well may have not crawled, may not have developed the articulation in those joints. They may also have toes that turn in. They may be flat-footed and trip over their own feet in a way. So this is the child that they're not chosen for teams, right? They're slowest. If you have a relay race, they're going to be the last ones to get there. So they're never chosen. I want to make sure that we're on time with everything, so we can maybe even have some time for questions this time. When you their vocalization, I said sometimes they scream. Sometimes that's the way to get more attention in their environment. So for the baby, this is when they're developing their loud, their vital cry, their help, I'm going to die kind of cry. I'm hungry, I'm going to die. Wah! But for the child that doesn't have that brain matured, they can easily be the ones that scream because they need the stimulus themselves, right? So when we go over one more box, we're taking a look at fine motor at this stage. Now, this is the stage for the infant. For the infant, when that hand that has been in a fist starts to release and open out. So a little baby, right at birth, they got that thumb tucked pretty tightly in there. You put your finger in there, and it's hard to get your finger back out. This is the stage when the hand opens up. Now, if your tendency as a child in school who has an unresolved issue here is to pull your hand into a fist, this is going to be really problematic for writing. This is the child who may still be writing like this with their whole hand. Thank you for flipping the picture there. Or the hand can cramp with anxiety, or they might just throw the pen down and not want to write. And they very, very likely have poor penmanship. So the kids that I work with who have primarily learning and sort of social skills behaviors that are challenged at this level are the poor readers who can't track, who are clumsy. They often act like the bully. They're the loud ones. They're the chaos producers in the classroom. And everything about them feels awkward and clunky. Now, this is a gross generalization, of course, because every child is unique and every brain is a universe unto itself. But in general, this is the kind of thing that you're going to see in children that have disruptions at that level. And what do you do about that? Oh my goodness. What we do is that we go back to the developmental stage that is missing. And there's nothing that makes more sense to me. And hopefully through the course of having watched 1, 2, or 3 of these webinars, hopefully it makes sense to you that we can reclaim the strength of these levels of the brain. We can reclaim the integration. We can help that brain mature so that we do not need to work from a sort of top-down approach, like a reward system for being good in the classroom, or sort of bribing the other kids to get this kid on the team, even though they do run funny. We want our kids to be able to track. We want them to be able to be calm when the fire alarm goes off. We want them to not need to tip over desks to make a point. We want them to be able to run so that they can keep up with their peers. And we want their fine motor skills to be developing. So that's what it looks like at that level. Now, what we do about it, we're going to go back to the crawling, but we're also going to go back to reflexes, whole body movement patterns, sensory activities that put these functions into place. And last week we had talked about anxiety. And I will say that when I first started and I was not working with so many anxious kids, we would just do this program and the kids would get better and they would be done in like with a year or two, and then they go off to school, perfectly competent children. With the anxieties that we're now seeing that I had talked about last time, sometimes we have to work a lot more on parenting and dealing with the underlying anxiety, the source of that anxiety as well. So, but when it's straightforward learning disability, sometimes it's very easy to move through it. Now we're going to move up. We're going to move up to that mid-brain or mid-cerebrum. And I want to talk about eyes here. Now we had said in that first half of the first year, we're going to start getting that horizontal tracking. But now in the second half of that first year, which is the more of the average, we're going to get vertical tracking. What that has to do with learning is looking up to a teacher and down to the desk, or up to a screen and down to the desk. And I know everybody's kind of stuck on computers right now, so it's all the same focus. But when we look up and down, we have to be able to hold information and transfer it down and go back and forth. But it also is going to apply to reading, because if you read across a line, you have to be able to jump down to the next line, not missing a line, not rereading the same line. And I've worked with so many children who've had difficulty with this. And I've worked with a very bright little girl who didn't have her vertical eye tracking. And her method of reading was to have a straight line underneath her reading, or she'd sit next to her daddy and she'd say, "Daddy, what line am I on?" And he pointed out, and then she'd get to the end of the line, "Daddy, what line am I on?" And he'd have to follow each line with her. So we do need to have our vertical tracking. But another skill that starts coming on board at this stage is that your two eyes begin to converge. So two eyes look at the same thing at the same time. And that's called visual convergence. If you took a model of the brain and took away these lower two levels that we've talked about already, looked up at this mid-cerebrum, you'll see that the nerves that go to the muscles that pull the eyes in go through that part of the brain. And we need to see two things, or one thing with two eyes, because otherwise we're going to get a double image when we're reading. But nobody can see, nobody knows it. If you see double, you don't know it, unless you just got hit in the back of the head and you go, wow, and for a couple of days you see double, but then the brain cannot make sense of double. So it changes it into a different experience. So the words might seem like they move a little bit on the page. Or for some kids, the words move, they tumble in towards the center of the page. I worked with one little girl who said, "I don't have any problem reading, but it's hard, when the letters go off of the end of the book and then they go into the air." So that was an example of a child that was just not able to focus her eyes on the page. Some of the kids have described letters going from black to gray to black to gray. And why would that be? Well, if your eyes are really focused, you see that solid black letter. But if they suddenly start to wander, you get a little shadow around the letters. And then you start to getting that gray effect. So these are the kids that are going to have maybe stress when they're reading, or headaches. Do they need glasses? Well, there's some people that will correct for that, but it's not really a visual acuity issue, it's a neurological issue. So if we get it at the level of the brain, then the kids can just naturally see the way hopefully all of us in this group do. We can see one object when we're looking at it, or one word on the page. These kids they can rub their eyes, or they might have to, and check yourself on this too. This is interesting. You read several times to get the meaning. Now, I was a very good student, and I graduated from high school with honors, and I went to the university, and I suddenly was looking at all these books with very tiny fonts and reading 60 pages of Irish history and studying astronomy and all kinds of difficult visual tasks. And so I realized that I was rereading everything. I would read and I go, well, wait a minute, what did that say? And I go back and reread it, and then I'd read it a third time. And so that was really demeaning to me. Now, nobody knew that I did that except me because I continued to get good grades, but it eroded my sense of being a smart person. And I think that's really tragic when that happens to kids. If they have to read it 2 or 3 times, that's a real erosion of confidence. Now, the solution that many people have found is to get a reading tutor. And I want to say that I like reading tutors and I've met some really good ones, but the last thing I would do is call a reading tutor. I would call a reading tutor, but that way I would do that last. Because first of all, we need to know if your child can see the page. If the letters are jumping and bouncing or turning colors or wandering off the page, we need to know that and correct their vision. And the very hardest thing to do at that moment is to ask that child to read out loud to prove that they can read. Because reading out loud, and I don't know about you, but for me, when I read out loud, I make mistakes. And if I were a child already aware that I had a reading issue, and I made a mistake, my stress levels would go up, the cortisol levels go up, suppressing the hippocampus, which is your one of your learning and memory centers, and making the task that much more difficult. So we want to know if they can see the words on the page. That's the first step to reading. And many of our kids surprisingly can't, and many very smart kids surprisingly can't see the words on the page. So we're going to move over on that chart to the next little box that says auditory. And this is really important. This is the place when we start understanding meaningful sound. And what does that mean? That means appreciation of tonality. So if you're a teacher in a classroom and you say, class, I want you to sit down, get out your arithmetic book, and look at chapter 3. Da, 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 da. I put bullet points into what I just told you. Sit down, get out your arithmetic book, and look at chapter 3. Now, the child that is unable to hear tonality may not hear the bullet points because you know from what I just said, 3 things are happening. I said da 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 da. Right? There's a third thing there. You can hear it coming because I did bullet points. These are little cues that I'm giving to a class. But if you don't hear that there are bullet points, you can have 2 or 3 kids in the class who sit down and then just sort of wonder what everybody else is doing because they only heard one. And when you have a class of 22 to 32 children and a significant portion of them can't hear the tonality, you have a lot of chaos in the classroom. The kids also can't hear sarcasm and humor. So in the school, in the social groups in school, they may, and this can be like at many different ages, they may miss out on the jokes. They may miss that they're being teased. Again, they can be teasable kids. When we get over to the language section, which is on the output side of the chart, they also are no good at telling jokes. They can't pull off a punchline to save themselves. They miss the main point of the conversation. You ask them to wait their turn, and waiting your turn usually involves waiting till you hear someone else finish their statement. Then you raise your hand. Me. Well, these kids cannot hear the flow of conversation, so they may not be able to hear when that conversation is paused and it's their turn. They don't get innuendo at all. And even understanding what comes next in the classroom. So the teacher's sitting there, folds the book closed, sets the attendance book aside, maybe, or whatever. I know you don't have attendance books right now, but sets the book aside and says, okay, class. And 90% of the class means we know it's recess now. And the kids that don't hear the social cues don't know what's happening next. They're lost, they're confused. So auditory, that ability to pick up on all the non-word aspects of communication. All the prosody, the music of it is critical, especially in a classroom setting. One-on-one, if you're one-on-one with a child, you can hold their face, speak right to them, slow your speech down so they understand your words. But in a group, it doesn't work very well. Now, if you look at the chart again, you see the next box says tactile. And that is also an important piece in our, I'm including here academics and just school performance. And performance involves other children, right? We have to be able to be in that social group. So this is the part of our brain that helps tell us where our body is in space. And if someone comes and stands too close to you, then you move away a little bit. You make a little distance. We know that we do it subconsciously. We just know what our personal space is. But for a lot of our children, they can't understand the personal space. They can't understand it. So we teach them the bubble. Stay in your bubble. Here's your bubble. Okay, Andre, draw the bubble around you. That's where you stay. And then the minute the teacher turns his back, he's just right on top of another kid. Andre is right on top of Sean. You can't teach the bubble. It's an inherent sense of your own body's space. You could be teaching that bubble till they're 17 years old, and they're not going to really get it. They might try and measure it out because they've been in trouble so many times, but it's not that automatic, that natural response that you or I would have. And so just knowing where your body is in space keeps you from bumping into the furniture, annoying other children. A whole world of problems that you can run into if you don't know where your body is. Another function that comes on board during this period of time is the whole midline issue. And midline problems go so far beyond just whether you can cross the midline or not. These midline problems have to do, not only do you know right and left, but if and this is, let me step back 1 minute. The midline awareness, that whole ability to transfer information from one side of the brain to the other, goes through a bridge that unites the right and left hemisphere called the corpus callosum. And that corpus callosum is the only connection between the two hemispheres. Otherwise, they kind of just like fall apart against the skull if that weren't there. That's not the purpose of the corpus callosum, but that's, that's also a useful function. Without that bridge, without that awareness, these are the kids that reverse B's and D's. They reverse P's and Q's. They might reverse W's and M's. They might get all confused about the S and the 2 and the 5 and get all those sort of mixed up. Often they're the kids that they confuse under and over, in and out. They have a lot of confusion about these opposite words. But they are also kids. Now, for those of you that have kids that are described as having high fluency and low comprehension, that means they can read a lot of words, but they don't know what they mean. So think about the role that two brains have to play in comprehension. Your left hemisphere learns words. It learns a series of words. It learns the cat jumped over the fence because the dog was chasing it. So in your brain, if you're reading that out loud, you see the cat running across and the dog behind it. Poof, the cat goes over the fence. If your left hemisphere is very clever and knows lots of words, like you're in first grade and you could already spell forget, remember, thorough, you're a clever kid, but you don't have that connection over to the right hemisphere, you still may be low on the comprehension because those words have to consolidate into a story. And your right hemisphere puts all that together to create the context, the movie, the Netflix in your brain that allows you to see the bigger picture, what's happening. So these are the kids that have that diagnosis of high fluency, low comprehension. often they're put into programs where they're asked to visualize the words that have been said, as if practicing that would strengthen that skill. And what we need to do before we do that is we need to strengthen the corpus callosum. And then often all that other tutoring work isn't even necessary. But these are the kids too that can have really a hard time taking the right hemisphere information, like the global picture of what's going on, and take it over to the left hemisphere to turn it into a lineup of words. So here's my story that I tell to illustrate this. Say your child is at school and they were in the lunchroom. Remember when we had school in lunchrooms, right? They're in the lunchroom and the lunch lady falls down and she hits her head and she's on the floor. And you've got a second grader and they pull the kids back and out of the room, and then there's a siren, and then they look out the window and they're taking her on a stretcher and putting her in the ambulance, and off goes the ambulance with the lights and sirens. So the principal writes a note home and says, "We had an incident at school today. Please ask your child to talk to you about this." And, they come home and ask Adam, "Well, what happened in school today?" Um, it was noisy. What was noisy, Adam? Um, mm, the truck. What truck, Adam? That was a noisy truck. Tell me about the noisy truck. It had lights. It had lights. Tell me more. Well, Mrs. Brown, she went in the truck. And this child, you just feel like you're pulling it out of them like this. This child may have the whole story intact in their head, but taking that picture and lining it up into words, it's a pretty complex thing that our brain does. Lining it up into words is beyond them, especially when they're under stress. So they can be very poor storytellers. They may know very well what they saw when they went to the zoo. They saw the orangutan playing with a swing, but they can't take that picture and put it into words. So they can't tell you what they did over the weekend. Sometimes these are the kids that seem to get, I'm going to say sort of colloquially, that they get stuck in one hemisphere. So you've got a little guy over in the corner who's playing feverishly with the Legos and putting something together. And Jeremy, he doesn't hear you at all. He may have a capacity to just sort of shut down the left hemisphere for any incoming information because of the immaturity in the corpus callosum, just focusing on the Legos in this little tower that he's building, or an airplane or whatever. So these kids seem to get stuck and unresponsive as well. Now, we talked last time about a lot of other features and a lot of other things that can happen with this challenge at the corpus callosum, but basically, these are the kids with the sensory processing issues that are taking in all of this information and not filtering it. Also this corpus callosum issue of not being able to sort of put things in their place. And in fact, these are the kids that end up with the issues of ADHD. Let me go back to the sensory processing for just a minute, because I think I've underserved that topic. Visually and auditorily and tactily, we need to be able to filter out what we don't need to attend to. If the teacher is talking, probably most of our attention should be on the teacher and not on the lineup of kids who went by the window on the way to another classroom, or on the fact that Sally dropped a pencil on the floor over the far end of the room, or that maybe the door is a little bit ajar. But for some of our kids, because they have an immaturity at this level of the central nervous system, they're paying attention to everything all the time, non-selectively. And so these are the kids that end up with the label ADD. And they can't take charge of that if they have the additional challenge of the corpus callosum challenge. So and I think that they don't have a deficit of attention so much as they have a surplus of attention to everything all the time and unable to eliminate the things that they don't need to attend to. So let's take a look at their motor issues at this level too, because they too can contribute to the general learning in school and social environment. And I want to tell you a really exciting concept that we're working on. The human body is uniquely, the body, I'm saying what I mean here, the body is uniquely designed for intellectual learning because our lower body is it provides us with stability and support and grounding. It's called graviception. We can stand up for ourselves. We can stand our ground. We can take a stance. We can be firm in ourselves. And this frees the upper body. The upper body is to carve and reach out into our environment and to sculpt and create and push people away and pull them near, create relationship, reject relationship, but to create our world, even down to the ends of the fingers. And the fingers, each of them have a different sort of landing place on the cortex. And so when I work with kids that have very poor lower body integration, and they're moving themselves and holding themselves rigid and almost seem to lead from their chests, they don't have access to all of the creativity that feeds the cortex. Now, I think some of you know that this pointer finger is really important. When you see a baby going, wah, 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 when they want water, you know they're going to have language because this finger connects right up to language centers in the brain and anticipates language development. We know that the freedom to use our upper body creatively is a basis actually for the neurology that allows us to learn more easily. And so many of the kids that I work with autism are almost unaware that they have a lower body and they're not rooted in their lower body, and they use their upper body in very strange ways that inhibits the whole neurobiological system and is a part of the bigger picture of learning issues. So that is what I find really unique and exciting about working with the human body. And in terms of the gross motor skill, at this stage, the baby has been creeping when you go back to normal neurological organization. And when I say creeping, I mean they've been on their hands and knees. And if they've done that adequately, they have really supported the development of proprioception and hearing tonality and being able to track and align their eyes. So the creeping supports all of these functions, but it also it starts aligning the medial joints. For those of you that don't know anatomy a lot, that's your elbows and your knees, the joints that are in the middle there. And it adds to it adds to up to their adeptness in sports. It contributes to that. But the creeping, it calms the hypervigilant child. It aligns the eyes. It matures the corpus callosum. It supports these medial joints. And when we go back to it, when we replicate that stage of development, we get children who are more calm, more able to cope with their environment, more balanced, more adept in sports. So that's the gross motor activity that happens at that place, but the ramifications can show up clear up into school years and beyond. Now, the tonality. So we're talking here, the next box over after that motor box is language. And some of the kids, in the same way that they couldn't hear tone of voice, they may not be able to produce it. Their vocal tonality may be flat or exaggerated or otherwise inappropriate. It could be garbled. They could have stuttering. And that's something that we've dealt with a lot. A lot of kids that we work with have garbled speech or stutters. And there's a story I want to tell, but I'm going to save it to the end. So we get a maturation of their sort of social speech cueing and language production at this stage. And if they don't have it by the time they're in third, fourth, fifth, 10th, 11th grade, we could go back and start working on the part of the brain that creates that. Um, Now, the hands at this stage, you're getting more maturation, you're getting more distinct use of the fingers. The hand will still maybe pick up a tool with the whole hand, but they can also pick up little bits of cookie to put it in their mouth if they're a baby, or they can use they're beginning the process that allows them to use the pen. And when they get to the next stage, this is another uniquely human thing. We pose our finger and thumb like this. And when it's mature, it's a circle. And we take this very flexible unit and prop it against the other three fingers to write. And that's the ideal tool use that human beings use to write. So we need these hands. But when we're looking at the hands, we're also looking at their stress axis. So how you manage stress. Your stress axis is also called your HPA axis. So your hypothalamus, pituitary, adrenals all have to work together to manage stress. If that is weak, if it's not matured, if it's been injured, there's any injury on that stress axis, any kind of stress can throw you off. So time tests for our kids are really difficult. The whole thing of reading out loud, and then managing multiple streams of information that are coming through in the classroom, just dealing with this and that and the other thing, becomes absolutely overwhelming. I wanted to say something because lots of the people that I work with have had IQ tests for their kids. And I don't like IQ tests. And Jesse, if we could go back to the chart for a minute, I want to explain why. Because we had talked about the cortical brain being, the thinking, learning part of our brain that happens from about that green line up. That's the part of the brain that's being tested in an IQ test. And I think that when you go for a neuropsychological evaluation, they are assuming all that stuff that happened before a year, that's all over and done with. We're not taking that into consideration. So I think they are leaving something out of consideration that they don't know they're leaving out, which is all of the interference from the gaps at these lower levels of the central nervous system. And I think that it is truly unfair to children to do any kind of an IQ evaluation, because that IQ, that number sticks in your brain. And it doesn't have to be the number they have given you, even though they say, well, this is pretty much who your child is. But I watched one remarkable child go from a 73 IQ to 103 IQ after they had finished or integrating some of these lower levels of the brain, and we started working with the cortex. Certainly we do work with the cortex, it's just not the discussion tonight. So I know that a lot of parents come to us and want to see their children get into the 90th percentile. And I've talked to several families about that. The 90th percentile means something. It means that out of 100 kids, only 10 kids are up there, about above 90%. So we don't get every kid into the 90th percentile, but I think that the children that we work with are more likely to end up with in a higher percentile for academics, and they are more likely to catch up with their peers than children who don't get a chance, an opportunity to create these foundations. Now I'm going to tell you the story of a child that I'm working with, and this is related to her academics, but the picture is very big for this child, and the mom has shared this and is happy for me to share. Just don't share names. We'll call her Samantha, but she was an adopted child, and she'd had hypothyroidism. So when her parents went to get her, she was obese, She'd never crawled or crept or done any of the typical developmental activities. And they got her home and they found out she also had cancer. So she was in the hospital for a long time after they brought her home. And when I met her, she walked like a plate. She was that very tippy side to side waddle. She was 10 and I couldn't understand anything that she said. I had to have her mother interpret for her. Her parents, her speech therapist had given up on the speech. They said, we've come as far as we can come. She's 10, we can't understand anything she's saying. Very low grades. But what impressed me most between then and now was my sense of her abilities. And at that time, I thought, wow, if we get this girl a job bagging groceries at Walmart, this will be good. She'll be somewhat independent. She may have to live with her parents, but we'll get her out of the house. She'll have something she can do. And over the course of a long period of time, she's one of the longer clients I've worked with, her speech improved. And in fact, a year after we started working, her speech therapist ran into the family when they were shopping and said, oh my goodness, what's happened to Samantha? I think she's ready to come back to speech therapy. And now at the age of 14, we've worked with her for over 4 years, but she is neurotypical for speech. Her weight is only maybe 5 pounds more than it should be. She couldn't run when I met her. She did a fast shuffle. She couldn't hop on one foot. She is very close to being neurotypical in all areas. And last year, we were talking, her mom and I were talking about maybe she could go to community college with some support, which was a far cry from thinking about a career at Walmart. This year, she expressed to us, as she's turned a corner, she's really turned a corner even since last year, that she wants to go to veterinary school. She wants to go to veterinary school, or she wants to be an accountant. Now, her mom's an accountant, so I think her heart is with veterinary school. And Mom and I are looking at her and going, you know what? In 3 more years, this just might be possible. So we were just about in tears because the idea of taking a child at very consistent, very persistent work, but over 4.5 years going from job at Walmart, living in the basement, to I want to be a veterinarian and I'm headed there. It was really, really exciting and just so rewarding for me. It's why I do the work. So if we were to work with your child or yourself, or if you want to learn about how to do the work, because our next workshop is in 2 weeks, we're going to talk to people about how to become practitioners like Jessie. Let's see. What I want to move on to, let's see, any questions? All right. Jessie's asking about questions. I do want to share one thing. Let me move on. For people, just the people that came to this workshop, we have this wonderful book by Katie Johnson, who's a wonderful teacher, known as the best teacher in the school district for her ability to teach children reading. And what she does is she does this work and she does some vision therapy in the classroom for 15 minutes every morning, and it makes a huge difference. We've got 5 of these, so Jessie will tell you how to get one of those if you're interested. They're free. I'd like to just share with you that you can contact me at any time for information. I'm going to let Jessie take it over. I ran out of words.
If you are interested in getting your name into a raffle for winning one of those books, you can go into the chat and just write book, and I'll get your name and all of that information. And in addition, if you are interested in a free online screening, you can just put screening in the chat, and I will also get that information gathered, and we'll send out the winners in the next week. So looks like we're getting some in. Also, in addition to that, if anyone has any questions, just add them into the chat, and then we'll be able to go over those as well.
And I'm willing to stay for as long as you need. And I know that there's a debate coming up that some people, if you're here in the States, I know we've got people from other places here. Some people are interested in watching the debate. So there you go. It starts now if you want.
And I'm just writing down people who have put their names in. So,
Okay. All right. All right. So here's what we're going to do. I know it's kind of hard to, I've been talking a little bit endlessly here. It's a lot of information. And over the past 3 weeks, we've talked about the chart in general, just how babies develop. Last week, we talked about trauma and anxiety. We went through the same chart with reference to how trauma creates anxiety, how trauma impacts the brain, and how a traumatized brain sort of recreates trauma. This time is about learning. And we go through that same chart each time because it is our discipline. It is our way to anchor material in real testing rather than vague symptoms. I think vague symptoms get collected, and they get collected, and they get labels put on them. Like this collection of symptoms gets called Asperger's, and this collection of symptoms gets called dyslexia. What we're looking to do is to pin those symptoms to the brain itself and missing functions. So once you address those functions, get those functions back for children, then some of those symptoms disappear. We never treat symptoms. We always just work with the brain itself. So if you work with me, that's what we work with. We work with the brain itself. Thank you so much for being here. And write me with any questions at all, and we'll get books and screening information out to you. I just want to advertise that in 2 weeks, we are going to have information about training. We had a solid training protocol set up, and then COVID hit. So Jesse's a wonderful curriculum developer, and we are working on how do we do this in the midst of COVID, because our kids are not getting better just because we can't treat them, right? So we need to figure out how to train more people to do this work. Thank you all.
and I want to say one thing before we sign off. To Hannah, yes, I will send out the chart again with the email, with the replay and everything, so you'll get that. The replay will come out within 3 days, so that will be coming out to everyone.
Natalia wants to say something.
Oh, I'll read it. Hold on. We have
not Natalia. I'm sorry, I just like a little brain fried. Natalia, yes.
Oh, I don't see Natalia's, but I see something here that asks. I'm just going to read the question.
Oh, wait. No, that wasn't true. Okay, sorry, Natalia. My arrow just hit the wrong thing.
This question says, a child now 10, I'm guessing they say they also have ADD, was seriously clogged for the first part of his life, missed many developmental milestones, and was way behind for school. Not dumb, but definitely behind. Where might he be stuck? So that would probably be a good one to put your name in for a free screening, or reach out to Bette.
Why don't you? Because as you know, that was what I was saying. I don't know until we pin all the information to the chart itself, but missing developmental milestones is a setup for learning disabilities. And one of those ways we miss developmental milestones, by the way, is walkers, jumpers, swings, baby bumbles. Get rid of them. But I would love to answer that question in a half hour. Like take time and do it in detail. Okay.
And we'll be sending out that replay. We'll be sending out, we'll be emailing those people who won the 5 books and also the screenings. But again, you can always reach out to either of us with any questions, and we'll point you in the right direction. Thank you, Hallie, for the very nice compliment as well.
And please do share the video, because we are really anxious to get more kids well, not medicated, right? That's what we want. Thank you, everybody. Have a good evening.
Thank you so much.
Thanks. Bye-bye.